everyone, it's Nina. Thanks for joining me today for our day 2 of 5 ways in 5 days. Today we're going to be focusing on paste and glitter pastes, which are a really fun medium that you can use with stencils and inks and create some really cool backgrounds and effects on your cards. So in today's video, we're going to go over 5 different ways that you can use these mediums to create some really beautiful card projects. Before we get started, I really want to focus on the basics, especially for those of you who have never used paste before. I think this is a great segment into starting off this video because we're going to talk about what it is to use paste and what things you're going to want to have on hand. So obviously, stencils are a really great tool to use with paste, and of course you're going to need some cardstock. Throughout all of the projects today, I am going to be using Simon Says Stamp 120 pound white cardstock. You don't have to use this particular cardstock, but it works really well for holding up to paste techniques and also inks, which is what we're going to be working with today throughout this video. In addition to that, I also recommend having a surface on hand that you can easily clean. And I really enjoy using our Simon Says Stamp magnetic glass mat for these kind of techniques because one of the reasons why is that it's magnetic. So I can use a magnet while I'm working to help hold my products in place. But in addition, it's made from glass. So things like paste will clean up really easily off of the surface. You can also apply tape to this surface and it'll hold down really well. Now, one of the other things I really recommend, no matter what paste you're using, I truly think that mixing your paste prior to creating with them is going to give you the best results. And one of the reasons why is that paste can oftentimes have air bubbles get trapped into them. And so you really want to mix your paste up to make sure that there are no air bubbles trapped inside and you're going to get the best and smoothest results when applying your paste. When applying your paste, I do recommend having a few different tools on hand depending on what you're creating. So in my hands, I have a few different tools that you may see that are very common, one of which are palette knives. On the right, I have some palette knives that are more of a larger spreading kind of palette knife, and then the one on the left, this one is great for smaller applications or tight spaces. I also think having a stencil pal, which is basically a tool that will allow you to scrape across your surface, on hand is really helpful because if you have a large area that you need to smooth out and kind of thin out the amount of paste that's been applied to your project, this tool is very helpful for that. All right, so we covered tools. Now let's talk about how to use the paste. Using paste is really honestly very simple, and I'm going to show you that right now. So I have here a stencil that is actually applied over top of another stencil, which is a great way in showing you how you can layer stencils together to create new looks. But even if you were just using a single stencil, all you need to do is take some paste, and I recommend putting on more than you need initially because you're going to smear this across your stencil. And then the best part is just like icing a cake, you can thin this out and spread it out evenly across your stencil. So having more is helpful because you can see here I'm putting it back into the jar as I'm scraping. That's because I put more down than I actually needed, but by putting more down, it allows me to get a smoother result and I'm not going to have any areas that are too thin. Anytime you're stenciling, you're going to want to very carefully remove the mask from your project so that way you don't chance any smudging. The other thing I recommend is making sure that all of your tools get cleaned up right away because pastes are a very hard substance to clean off if you let them dry on your stencils. Even on your tools as well. Something like your palette knife, you're going to want to throw that into a little soapy bin or put everything into the sink right away because you're going to want to clean those so that the paste doesn't harden. So now that we've covered the basics, I hope you're feeling a bit more confident because now we're going to work on actually using these pastes to make some cool projects. First off, we're going to show you how you can put paste over top of ink blending. So let's say you have an ink blended background. We're going to create that first. I have a stencil here from Simon Says Stamp. This is a BOHO heart stencil, and I'm going to use a few different shades of Simon Says Stamp inks to apply this onto the stencil. So we're going to stencil just as we would for any other stenciling project. I'm using Simon Says Stamp blending brushes and also positively saturated inks to blend through this stencil. So now we're going to bring in some paste. These are Ranger's Stickles glitter gels. There's a whole variety of different colors with these. Now for this particular paste, this is going to be a bit of a translucent paste, and that's what you're going to want for a technique like this. Any translucent paste, whether it's a color or clear, as long as it remains translucent when you apply it, you can use those pastes for this technique. And as you notice, I'm using those pastes in the exact same areas that I used the corresponding ink colors with. So for any areas that I had some green ink blending, we'll put green paste. Teal ink blending, we're going to put teal paste. And of course yellow for the yellow ink blending. And we're going to use the smaller of our palette knives for this project because we want to make sure we don't put too much paste in areas that we don't want it. So I don't want too much of the green going into the yellow areas. So by having a smaller palette knife, it's going to allow me to have more control in the application of the paste. Once I've gone ahead and covered the entire stencil, then I'm going to take that palette knife and carefully scrape off any excess paste that might be on top. You don't have to do this, but what happens is that it's going to provide a smoother application of the paste when you scrape off any lumpy areas. So we're going to have this really nice application of paste over top of that ink blending. We're going to try this technique again because this technique can be used in a few different ways. I have another stencil here. This one happens to be the XL Rose Bouquet stencil from Simon Says Stamp. And I'm going to tape this onto my project, but I'm going to tape it only on the left-hand side of the project because I want to create a hinge. I'll show you why that hinge is important as we go along here. But first we need to work on ink blending. So I'm going to take some Simon Says Stamp inks in both red and pink shades, and we're going to color in all of the roses. I'm using small blending brushes so that way I can maintain control as I add those inks over those areas. Then we'll transition over to some green shades, and I'm going to apply those into the areas that have leaves. I used two different shades of green for the leaves because I did want to add a bit of shading to them, so I used both sage and also pine for the green ink blending. So once we have all the ink blending done, I'm going to carefully lift off the right side of the stencil, and underneath of the stencil we're going to slip some scrap pieces of paper. This is why I left the other side of the stencil completely free of any tape, and we're creating that hinge on the left side. So that way we can clean off the stencil and we're not going to contaminate any of the paste that we're going to apply on top. This paste happens to be Texture Paste Transparent Gloss. This paste is going to dry completely transparent, so that way we can still see the beautiful colors underneath of the paste, but we're going to get a gorgeous glossy finish on top of this ink blending. So I'm going to carefully apply this paste over top of the entire stencil design, and then once we've got it smoothed out, I'm going to remove the stencil and we're going to let this completely dry before we do anything else to this project. Anytime you're removing stencils off of your project, you really want to work slowly because you don't want to shift any of this paste that you have applied. This can easily be disturbed. Unlike any stenciling that you might do, you can shift the stencil and not have it ruin your project. But paste is liquid, so we definitely want to make sure that we're being very careful when we're working with it. We're going to keep working with that transparent gloss paste because that paste is very versatile. We're going to work now with using that paste with glitter because you can make your own glitter paste with this. I'm going to start first by taking a stencil that's called Polka Hearts. It's a two-piece stencil that has some polka dots on the left and hearts on the right. This allows you to create layered designs, which is really fun. I'm going to use this stencil with some Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated inks. I also have two different types of glitter on hand for adding the glitter onto my paste. But first we need to ink blend. I'm going to start by ink blending through the polka dots to create a layer of color that's going to go underneath of my paste application. So to create this, I used different shades of positively saturated inks, which were Cherry, Sherbet, Sunbeam, and then once I finish off the Sunbeam, I want to move the stencil over so that way I can continue this pattern across the other side of my paper. I did clean the stencil in between these layers. So now that I've shifted the stencil back over, reapplied some tape in order to prevent me from adding any ink in places that I don't want it, especially on the side of the paper where we've already done our ink blending, then I can move on to adding the additional colors of ink. Those colors included Limelicious, Tropic, and also Cadet. And these are going to finish off that beautiful rainbow of color that we've got going on here. Now that we have all of our ink blending done, we want to go ahead and start adding some paste. So I have the heart layers of this stencil now, and I'm shifting that back over to where we started. I'm going to tape it in place and make sure I tape any areas, including those polka dots on the left-hand side of the panel, so that way I don't get paste on them. Then I'm going to apply that paste through the stencil, so that way we get a really nice thin skim layer of paste on top of here, which will serve as an adhesive. Because when paste is still wet, when it's wet, you can add elements on top and allow them to dry on the paste and it will hold onto it. So for this particular technique, I'm going to use glitter. Now I like to use the pinch technique where you put your fingers in, you pinch a little bit of glitter in between your fingertips, and just like salt when you're cooking, you're going to sprinkle that over top of the paste. Now for the second layer of paste, because that first layer was just a sprinkle, now I can apply a finer bit of glitter on top of that chunky glitter, and we're going to create a two-tone glitter effect here. Now this stencil, of course, is a two-part stencil, and I was covering a larger area than the stencil actually covers. So I needed to work in stages, and I let the right-hand side of the card dry before I worked on the left side. But we're going to repeat that exact same process of sprinkling the glitter over top of the wet paste, and then finally we'll get this beautiful background covered with sparkly glitter hearts that was made possible by using the paste as an adhesive. Now we've looked at using paste with palette knives. That's a very common tool that most people use when working with paste. However, if you have a paste that is opaque and you want it to be a little bit more translucent so that you can still see some beautiful ink blending underneath, I really like using a blending tool to help me create a more translucent effect. So I've pulled out a bunch of Simon Says Stamp Rainbow Mini Glitz Glitter Gels. I also have some Tim Holtz mini round blending tools with the little sponge foams on top. I really like these sponge foams because you can clean them if you want to after using them with the paste, but they're also removable and you can toss them aside if you don't want to keep them. And I have a whole bunch here because we're going to need one for every color that we're going to work with through this stencil, because I have a rainbow background here. So I'm going to take the paste and also the stencil that I had done the ink blending with, reapply the stencil on top of my ink blending, and tape it all back into place. I did want to clean off the stencil before I went through and added the paste on top. We're going to take our paste and our blending tool and start putting that into the paste and picking up some of the glitter paste. We're going to apply it through the stencil, but we're not going to use these blending tools like we normally would for ink blending. Rather, we're going to use them as daubers. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the paste and our ink blending tools and picking up the paste and carefully applying it through the stencil with a tapping motion. This is going to provide just a bit of glitter on top of our stenciling so that the paste will sparkle as it catches the light and our ink blending will glitter beautifully. However, because we're applying such a thin layer over top of this ink blending, it's still going to allow the ink blending to show through. So we're not going to completely cover this background with the paste. We're just dabbing the paste on top in an even but very thin layer. Once this is done, you'll see how we have this beautiful glittery finish on top of the ink blending. If you were to have applied this particular paste, which is completely opaque, over top of this ink blending with a palette knife, you would have gotten a very opaque finish. It would not have shown up as a very thin layer like this where you get that beautiful shimmer on top of the ink blending. We wanted to maintain that ink blending in order to showcase how beautiful it is, but accent it with the glitter. All right, one of my most favorite ways to use paste is to put it onto clear plastic. And for those of you that love edge-to-edge shaker cards, I think you're going to go crazy over this technique. So clear plastic is fantastic for making shaker cards or windows, and we're going to use this thin piece of plastic that I got from some stamp packaging as an edge-to-edge shaker window. I have a stencil here, which is from Simon Says Stamp. This is the Painted Wreath stencil, and we're going to attach this over top of the clear plastic. I'll use my magnet to hold it down and then also add a couple pieces of tape to keep the stencil and the plastic together. I'm using some stencil butter for this particular technique. This is a opaque paste that is very creamy, and it's going to give me a really nice pearlescent finish over top of the clear plastic. I really want to make sure I thin this out and smooth it very well, so I'm going to bring in the stencil pal for this and scrape over top of the paste to really get that as the thinnest layer possible. I'll use my palette knife to scrape off that excess, put it back into the jar, and then I'll use my palette knife one more time to really smooth out that paste. I want this to be as thin as possible so that it doesn't warp the plastic and it also will dry quicker. So I removed the plastic from the stencil and we're going to let this dry completely before we turn this into a card. No matter what paste you're working with, I can't tell you how important it is to make sure that you're keeping your work surface and your tools completely clean of any paste, because all pastes are very difficult to clean off once they've dried onto your tools, your stencils, and other crafting supplies. So really take care in making sure, no matter what you're working with, that you take care to clean up between your stenciling projects. All right, so we've made a whole bunch of backgrounds using paste. Why don't I show you how I ended up turning these particular pieces into finished cards. We'll start first with the application of paste onto the clear plastic. That's the one we just finished up working with. You can see how it dried. It looks really pretty. We're going to turn this into an edge-to-edge shaker. I've got some different colors of green inks from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to work on creating a nice halo of color around my white cardstock. 120-pound white cardstock from Simon is a great cardstock for not just paste, but it also holds up well to ink blending. So that's what I use throughout all of my projects here. After I applied all of the ink blending onto my background and I got this nice halo of green color, I'm going to take some water and splatter that over top of my background. Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated Inks are water reactive. As you can see, it creates some really nice water splatters. I accented that with a bit of Pearl Mist from Brutus Monroe, and then I applied a bit of Rustic Wilderness Green Distress Stain on top of that background for a nice bit of contrast. So we have a really nice textured background here that's going to look beautiful behind our edge-to-edge shaker panel. I need to add a bit of adhesive all the way around all four sides of my background here, so I'll use some red line tape to do that. I'll remove the release paper from 3 sides of that red line tape and then carefully align my paste covered edge-to-edge shaker window onto the panel. So I'll lay that face down and then also lay the background face down on top of that. Starting with one side at a time, I'll start wrapping all the edges of my clear plastic around my panel. So that way I completely encase the background panel with this clear plastic. Paste is very forgiving, so on a surface like this, it will bend very easily. So now you can see we have this background panel completely wrapped in our plastic minus the top opening there. That's so that way we can drop in some sequins. So I have a mix of sequins here called Flowering Clover from Simon Says Stamp. I'll fill my shaker with that and then close up the last edge of my shaker so that way it will completely encompass those sequins inside. I love how that paste just shines on top of that plastic and over top of the background to create a really dramatic effect. To finish off the card, I just added a simple sentiment on top that I had stamped and embossed with white embossing powder onto black cardstock. Next up, we're going to take that panel that we did with the ink blending and the translucent gloss paste on top. I used a scalloped border rectangle die from Simon Says Stamp to add that border along the bottom, and then I tied around a bit of twine onto the bottom portion of the card panel. A simple sentiment that says thanks was all I needed to complete this card. I really liked the simplicity of this, so that way it allowed those gorgeous glossy roses to really take center stage. I did add a bit of embellishment with some moonshine sequins from Simon Says Stamp. These are like a confetti type of sequin, and they add just a nice bit of sparkle on this card that doesn't take away from the gorgeous shine of the roses. So as I turn this, you're going to get a really good look of how that paste glistens with that glossy finish on top of the ink blending. It makes the ink blending even more vibrant than it already was, and it provides that glossy finish. It almost looks like this was foiled. Alright, so remember how we did that glitter over top of the wet paste? Well, this looks fantastic completely dried. We get these really sweet clear hearts on top of our colorful ink blended background. I thought I'd pair that with a sentiment that says you make me smile, because this background really does make me smile. And I thought I'd embellish it with a few half pearls. These are from Lucy's cards. These are a jelly bean mix of half pearls. Lots of pretty colors, and one of the things I love best about mixes like this is that they come with so many different colors in them that you can really pick and choose from the mix to find colors that match well with your project. So I found half pearls in that mix that I could mix and match together with the different sections of colors in the background to really accent the shades that I used here. This DIY glitter paste effect is a really fun way to be able to use your loose glitters. Alright, next up we have our large background that we had created with the Glitz glitter gels applied with the blending tools. I thought I'd bring in a sentiment here from the Clean Line Stacks sentiment set. Now this is actually a pair of two different greetings that I compiled together onto the same stamp to turn into one super large greeting. I stamped this onto some black cardstock with embossing ink and then used white embossing powder to apply that on top of the stamping, so that way I get a really nice crisp finish on top of this black cardstock. Now you'll notice I have some powder tool applied to the cardstock. I'll wipe that off and you can see we'll get that nice black cardstock to show back up again. Now because I had turned this into one super large greeting, I couldn't use the coordinating dies to cut this out. So I just used my fussy cut scissors to trim the greeting out, and then I popped it up right on top of the center portion of the card. Now I did leave a little bit of room for underneath to add a secondary greeting. And this happened to be from the You Are Loved sentiment set from CZ Design and Simon Says Stamp. I embossed that onto some pink cardstock because that was one of the colors that was down below on that bottom right hand corner. So I pulled that out of the colors there and picked a dull pink cardstock to use for that greeting. And that added a really nice touch to this card. I finished things off with a few colorful sequins here and there around the background. But as you can see, those Simon Says Stamp Rainbow Glitz glitter gels took center stage on this card and really accented the blending that we had done on the background. It completely changed the look of those pastes by turning them from something more opaque into something a bit more translucent. So with the panel that we had done a bit of colorful blending on earlier in the video using the Ranger's Stickles glitter gels on top of the Simon Says Stamp BOHO Heart Circle stencil, I'm going to use that as a background for some flowers. I have this really pretty etched layered daisy that I had die cut from white cardstock and then colored with some Simon Says Stamp inks. I also used a meadow leaf die from Simon to create some really nice greenery to go with the etched daisy, and I'll glue those around the daisy with some Simon Says Stamp Craft Tacky Glue. Any excess that's hanging off the edges, I'll make sure I trim with my scissors so that way it'll fit into an A2 card. That background was the inspiration for the colors that I used on this card with the daisy. That's why I used the teal color for the center, and it really made this flower pop. I really enjoyed having this background so textured because it really complemented the texture that's in the die that creates this really pretty flower. I did use a Simon Says Stamp sentiment strip to serve as the greeting for this card. There was so much going on, I wanted it nice and simple, so I just added that along the bottom portion of the flower after I added a little bit of black edging to that sentiment strip to make sure I hid any part of the white core of the paper. All that texture with the beautiful Stickles Glitz glitter gels back there really complemented the flower here, and I just love how this turned out. I did also add a few dewdrop gems around this card, and those are just a very soft moonstone color, very pretty, and adds a little bit of a dewy effect to this card. So many different ways that you can utilize paste in your projects. Everything from adding paste over top of inks to using paste onto plastic. All the different techniques that are possible with paste allow you to take your cards up a notch. And I really hope that you have learned some great ideas that you can utilize in your card projects upcoming using paste. Thanks so much for tuning in for today's portion of 5 Ways in 5 Days. I hope you enjoyed it. And please stay tuned for more 5 Ways in 5 Days inspiration coming up this week. Until I see you all again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye!